Welcome to Paranormal Pages. Let's get straight into the true scary stories. The Watcher in the Field. I've lived in this quiet countryside town my whole life, nestled between rolling hills and vast, empty fields. There's something serene about the isolation, or so I thought until recently. My neighbor, old Mr. Corbett, has a scarecrow in his field that's always given me the creeps. It's not the way it looks, it's raggedy like most scarecrows, with a faded shirt, straw-stuffed limbs, and a floppy hat. No, it's something else, something I can't quite put my finger on. It always seems to be in a different position each time I look at it. Some days, it's leaning forward as if beckoning me closer. Other days, its head is cocked to the side, like it's listening to something I can't hear. Today, though, the scarecrow wasn't there at all. As I walked past Mr. Corbett's field on my way home from work, I stopped dead in my tracks. The wooden post where the scarecrow usually stood was empty. My eyes scanned the field, but there was no sign of it anywhere. It was strange, unsettling even, but I shrugged it off. Maybe Corbett took it down for repairs or something. Yet, the unease gnawed at the back of my mind, growing stronger with each step I took towards home. By the time I reached my front door, dusk had settled over the town, casting long shadows across the empty fields. As I fumbled with my keys, a chill crept up my spine. I glanced over my shoulder at the Corbett place, half expecting to see that damned scarecrow back on its perch, but the field was still empty. The unease intensified as I unlocked the door and stepped inside. I closed the door behind me and flipped on the lights, trying to shake off the strange feeling that something was watching me. I moved through the house, checking the windows out of habit. That's when I saw it, a flicker of movement outside, just at the edge of my vision. My heart skipped a beat as I looked closer, my breath catching in my throat. There, standing at the edge of my yard, was the scarecrow. It was facing my house, its arms outstretched as if welcoming me. I blinked, and for a moment, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me, but no. It was really there, its presence so wrong, so out of place that a cold sweat broke out on my skin. I backed away from the window, my pulse hammering in my ears. This isn't happening, I muttered to myself, forcing a nervous laugh. It's just a prank or something. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. There was something more sinister at play, something I couldn't explain. I grabbed my phone and dialed Mr. Corbett's number, my hands trembling as I waited for him to pick up. The phone rang and rang, but there was no answer. Finally, the line went dead, leaving me alone in the suffocating silence of my house. I looked back at the window, but the scarecrow was gone. Panic surged through me as I scanned the yard, but it was empty. My fingers tightened around the phone as I tried to calm myself. Maybe I had imagined it, maybe the stress of the day was getting to me. But as I turned away from the window, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly, terribly wrong. Hey! Subscribe for more true scary stories. That night, sleep eluded me. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the scarecrow standing in my yard, its hollow eyes staring at me through the darkness. The memory gnawed at me, and no matter how much I tried to rationalize it, I couldn't escape the deep-rooted fear that had taken hold. Every creak and groan of the house set my nerves on edge, making me jump at shadows. When sleep finally came, it was shallow and restless, filled with nightmares of twisted figures and whispers that I couldn't quite understand. Morning brought no relief. The unease from the night before lingered like a bad taste in my mouth. I tried to go about my routine, coffee, breakfast, a quick glance at the morning news, but nothing felt normal. My mind kept drifting back to that scarecrow and the way it had been standing, its posture almost human, almost too real. I told myself I had to get a grip, that it was just a silly trick of the mind. But when I looked out the window toward Mr. Corbett's field, my blood ran cold. The scarecrow was back in its usual spot, but it was different. Its head was turned, facing directly towards my house, and its arms were positioned in such a way that it almost seemed like it was pointing at me. My heart pounded as I stared at it, the sense of being watched growing stronger with each passing second. I forced myself to look away, to push down the panic rising in my chest. It's just a scarecrow, I muttered to myself, but the words felt hollow, meaningless. I decided to confront Mr. Corbett to get some answers. Maybe he could explain why the scarecrow had moved, or at least reassure me that I was just imagining things. I grabbed my coat and headed out the door, my mind racing with questions. The walk to his house felt longer than usual, the air thick with tension. When I finally reached his front door, I hesitated, my hand hovering over the doorbell. Taking a deep breath, I pressed it, listening to the chime echo through the house. There was no answer. I rang again, then knocked, louder this time. Still nothing. My unease deepened as I stepped back, looking around. The house seemed deserted, the windows dark and lifeless. I called out his name, but the only response was the sound of the wind rustling through the trees. It was as if Mr. Corbett had vanished. I circled around to the back of the house, hoping to find some sign of life, but the backyard was just as empty as the front. The only thing that caught my eye was an old shed at the edge of the property, its door slightly ajar. Against my better judgment, I approached the shed. As I got closer, the air grew colder, and an overwhelming sense of dread washed over me. I reached out to push the door open, my hand trembling as it made contact with the rough wood. The door creaked loudly as it swung open, revealing the dim interior. My breath caught in my throat as I stepped inside, the darkness swallowing me whole. The smell hit me first, a pungent, decaying odor that made my stomach churn. I gagged, covering my nose as I fumbled for the light switch. When the light flickered on, I froze. In the center of the shed, surrounded by old farming tools and piles of rotting hay, was the scarecrow. It was propped up on a chair, its head tilted down as if it had been sleeping. But that wasn't what made my blood run cold. The scarecrow's hands, if you could call them that, were clutching a bundle of tattered clothes. As I stepped closer, the realization hit me like a punch to the gut. The clothes were Mr. Corbett's. They were stained with something dark, something that looked disturbingly like blood. Before I could react, a cold draft swept through the shed, and the scarecrow's head snapped up. Its eyes, once empty and lifeless, were now filled with a malevolent gleam. It stared at me, its mouth twisting into a grotesque smile. I stumbled back, my heart pounding in my ears, but the door slammed shut behind me, trapping me inside. The light flickered, casting eerie shadows across the room as the scarecrow slowly began to rise from its chair. I stumbled backward, my hands clawing at the door, desperate to escape the shed. The scarecrow stood fully now, towering over me in the flickering light. Its movements were slow, almost deliberate, as if savoring the moment. Panic surged through me, and I pounded on the door, screaming for help, but my voice seemed to be swallowed by the darkness. The air in the shed grew heavier, suffocating, and with each passing second, the scarecrow crept closer. The wind outside picked up, howling against the walls of the shed, but there was something else carried within it, a faint, insidious whisper that sent shivers down my spine. It was like a chorus of voices, all murmuring at once, growing louder with each step the scarecrow took. I pressed my hands over my ears, trying to block out the sound, but it only grew more intense, more maddening. The words were unclear, but their intent was unmistakable. They wanted me to succumb, to give in to the terror that threatened to consume me. "Stop! Please, stop!" I shouted, my voice cracking with fear. The scarecrow halted, its head cocking to the side in a mockery of curiosity. For a moment, I thought it would relent, that maybe my pleas had reached some hidden trace of humanity within it. But then it moved again, faster this time, closing the gap between us in an instant. Its hand, or what passed for one, reached out, grazing my arm with a touch that was colder than death itself. I recoiled, pressing myself against the door, praying for some way out. The whispers intensified, swirling around me like a vortex, their meaning becoming clearer with every word. They spoke of hunger, of vengeance, of an ancient curse that bound the scarecrow to this place, feeding it with the fear of those who dared to cross its path. And now, it seemed, I had become its latest victim. In my desperation, my hand found the latch on the door. With a surge of adrenaline, I twisted it and threw the door open, stumbling out into the night. The wind hit me like a wall, nearly knocking me off my feet as I raced away from the shed. I didn't dare look back, even as the whispers followed me, echoing in my ears, urging me to return. I ran faster than I ever had in my life, fueled by pure, primal fear. I didn't stop until I reached my house, slamming the door behind me and locking it tight. My chest heaved as I leaned against the door, trying to catch my breath. The silence was deafening, but at least the whispers had stopped. My hands shook uncontrollably as I reached for my phone to call the police, but when I tried to dial, the screen remained dark, unresponsive. My heart sank as I realized the power was out. The lights had gone out, plunging the house into complete darkness. I fumbled for a flashlight, the panic creeping back as I realized just how vulnerable I was. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows as the storm grew fiercer. I switched on the flashlight, its weak beam cutting through the darkness, and moved cautiously through the house, every shadow a potential threat. As I approached the living room, I heard it, a soft, rhythmic tapping at the window. I froze, the light trembling in my hand as I slowly turned towards the sound. There, just outside the window, was the scarecrow. It was pressed up against the glass, its face distorted into a grotesque grin, its eyes glowing with an unnatural light. The tapping continued, a methodical, almost mocking knock, as if it was inviting itself in. My breath caught in my throat, and I backed away, but the scarecrow's eyes followed me, never breaking contact. I retreated into the hallway, the walls seeming to close in around me as the fear threatened to choke me. I needed to get out, to run, to find help, but every instinct screamed that it was too late. The whispers returned, louder now, filling the house with their malevolent chant. I had let the scarecrow in, and now there was no escape. The whispers grew louder, swirling around me like a storm. My heart pounded as I backed into the kitchen, the beam of my flashlight shaking in my hand. I could feel the presence of the scarecrow pressing in on me from all sides, even though I couldn't see it. The house, once familiar and safe, had become a labyrinth of shadows and unseen threats. I knew I couldn't stay here, but the thought of stepping outside, where the scarecrow roamed freely, filled me with a primal dread. I tried the back door, but it was jammed tight, as if the house itself was conspiring to keep me trapped. The whispers turned into a cacophony, their meaning clearer than ever now. They spoke of a pact, an ancient curse that bound the scarecrow to this land, demanding a sacrifice every so often. And somehow, in my ignorance, I had stumbled into its trap. I was the one chosen for the harvest, the final act in a ritual that had been repeated for generations. I had to find a way out. The front door was no longer an option. I was sure the scarecrow would be waiting for me there. The only other way was through the basement. It was a long shot, but the basement had a small window that led outside. If I could make it out of there and sprint across the field, maybe I could reach the old church on the edge of town. Its thick stone walls might offer some protection, at least until dawn. I hurried down the stairs, my footsteps echoing in the narrow space. The basement was cold and damp, the air thick with the smell of mildew and earth. The small window was just above the workbench, barely large enough for me to squeeze through. I moved quickly, pushing aside the clutter that had accumulated over the years. But as I reached for the window, the whispers crescendoed, filling the basement with their ominous chant. And then, the lights flickered back on, momentarily blinding me. When my vision cleared, I saw it, standing at the foot of the stairs, blocking my only exit. The scarecrow. It was taller now, more monstrous, its limbs elongated and twisted in unnatural ways. Its eyes glowed with an eerie light, and its mouth was twisted into that same ghastly grin. There was no escape. I stumbled back, my mind racing for a plan, but the scarecrow moved with unnatural speed, closing the distance between us in an instant. Its hand shot out, gripping my arm with a strength that defied its frail appearance. The touch was freezing, like death itself, and I could feel my energy draining away as it held me. The whispers were deafening now, filling my mind with their insidious message. Desperation took over. I grabbed the first thing I could find, a rusty old hammer from the workbench, and swung it at the scarecrow with all my might. The hammer struck its chest with a sickening thud, but the scarecrow didn't even flinch. Instead, it tightened its grip, pulling me closer, its eyes burning into mine. I could feel its cold breath on my skin, and I knew, in that moment, that I was doomed. But then, something unexpected happened. The scarecrow faltered, its grip loosening just slightly. I realized with a shock that the hammer had done something, maybe not to the scarecrow itself, but to whatever force was animating it. I swung the hammer again, this time aiming for its head. The blow connected, and the scarecrow let out a horrible, inhuman screech. It staggered back, releasing me, and I seized the moment. I scrambled for the window, wrenching it open with all the strength I had left. I squeezed through the narrow opening, the jagged edges of the window frame cutting into my skin as I pulled myself out into the night. The whispers followed me, now laced with fury, but they were fainter, as if the scarecrow's power was weakening. I hit the ground hard, the wind knocked out of me, but I forced myself to my feet and started running. The field was a blur around me as I sprinted toward the church, my lungs burning with each breath. Behind me, I could hear the scarecrow's enraged cries, but they were distant, growing fainter with every step. I didn't dare look back. All I could think about was reaching the church, finding sanctuary. Finally, I saw it, the old stone building rising up out of the darkness like a beacon. I threw myself against the heavy wooden doors, pounding on them with the last of my strength. The door creaked open, and I stumbled inside, collapsing onto the cold stone floor. The whispers were gone, replaced by a blessed silence. I lay there, gasping for breath, my heart still racing. I was safe, for now. But as I lay there, I realized something terrifying. The scarecrow wasn't defeated. I had only delayed the inevitable. The curse still hung over the town, and it wouldn't be long before the scarecrow found me again. And next time, there would be no escape. Hey! Subscribe for more true scary stories. Story 2. The Haunted Gambit. I had always been a collector of oddities. There was something about the history and mystery embedded in old objects that fascinated me. When I stumbled upon the dusty, forgotten chess set in a small antique shop on the outskirts of town, I knew I had to have it. The chessboard was intricately carved from dark, polished wood, and the pieces were astonishingly detailed, each one a tiny, grotesque work of art. The shopkeeper seemed eager to part with it, selling it to me for a price that felt like a steal. As I left the shop, I noticed the odd, relieved expression on his face, but I shrugged it off, too absorbed in my new acquisition. The first night I set it up in my study, I marveled at the craftsmanship. The pieces were heavy, almost too heavy for their size, and their intricate details sent a shiver down my spine. The king and queen, in particular, seemed to stare back at me with a malevolent intelligence. Despite a vague sense of unease, I decided to play a game against myself, carefully positioning the pieces on the board. I played until I grew tired, leaving the game unfinished as I headed to bed. I remember thinking that it would be interesting to see how the game would end, a challenge to my own memory and strategy. When I awoke the next morning, the chessboard was the first thing on my mind. I hurried to the study, half expecting to find everything just as I left it. But to my horror, the pieces had moved. The game had progressed by several moves. My white knight had been taken, and my queen was in a precarious position. A chill ran down my spine as I examined the board, trying to rationalize what I was seeing. Had I moved them in a sleepy haze during the night? But no, that didn't make sense. The moves were strategic, calculated, too deliberate to have been done unconsciously. That night, I decided to take precautions. I photographed the board, meticulously documenting the positions of each piece before going to bed. I locked the study door, the key heavy in my pocket, and drifted into an uneasy sleep, haunted by dreams of shifting shadows and whispering voices. When I awoke, a sense of dread clung to me like a damp fog. I hurried to the study, my heart pounding. The door was still locked, the key untouched. But as I stepped inside, the chill in the room deepened. The board had changed again. My king was now in check, the black pieces inching ever closer, as if taunting me. I began to feel a creeping paranoia. It wasn't just the chess pieces that seemed to move on their own. Objects in the room felt slightly out of place, and the atmosphere grew heavier, more oppressive, with each passing day. I started avoiding the study altogether, but the thought of the chessboard consumed me. Each night, I would reluctantly take one last look, photographing the new positions, only to find the game further along the next morning. I became obsessed with trying to win, convinced that there was some kind of sinister intelligence at play, something that was challenging me, pushing me toward an endgame I couldn't see. As the days went by, I felt myself unraveling. The pieces moved closer to checkmate, and I could feel the weight of impending doom pressing down on me. The nights were the worst. The house creaked and groaned, the air thick with an unnatural coldness. I began hearing faint, distant murmurs, as if the pieces themselves were whispering secrets in a language I couldn't understand. The shopkeeper's odd expression began to make sense, but it was too late to turn back now. I was trapped in a game with an unseen opponent, one who seemed to know my every move before I made it. And with each passing night, I realized that losing this game might mean more than just defeat on the board. As the game progressed, so did the dark presence in my home. It started small, a flicker of movement in the corner of my eye, a shadow where there shouldn't be one. I tried to ignore it, convincing myself that it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. But deep down, I knew that something was terribly wrong. The chessboard was no longer just an object, it was a portal, a conduit for something ancient and malevolent that had taken root in my home. Every time I stepped into the study, I could feel it watching me, waiting for my next move. One night, unable to sleep, I found myself drawn to the study. The house was eerily quiet, the only sound the creaking of the floorboards as I approached the door. I hesitated, my hand trembling as it reached for the key. When I finally turned it in the lock and opened the door, the air inside was thick and suffocating. The board was illuminated by the faint light of the moon, casting long, twisted shadows across the room. The pieces had moved again, but this time, the configuration was unfamiliar, a chaotic arrangement that made no sense. It was as if the game had abandoned all rules, spiraling into something far more sinister. I stood frozen, my eyes fixed on the board. That's when I noticed it, a small, dark stain on the wood, right where my queen had stood the previous night. I knelt down to examine it, my breath catching in my throat. The stain was a deep, crimson red, and as I touched it, my fingers came away sticky and warm. It was blood. Panic surged through me, and I stumbled back, my mind racing. How could this be possible? Was this some sick joke? Or was it a warning? The sound of footsteps behind me made my heart stop. I spun around, but the room was empty. I could feel the presence now, stronger than ever, a cold, malevolent force that seemed to pulse with dark energy. It was no longer content to simply move the pieces, it was toying with me, feeding off my fear. I rushed out of the study, slamming the door behind me, and ran to my bedroom. But sleep was impossible. I lay awake, listening to the silence, every creak and groan of the house sending my heart racing. The whispers had grown louder, closer, and I knew that whatever was haunting me was gaining strength. The next morning, I woke up with a start, drenched in sweat. The sun had barely risen, casting a pale light through the curtains. My first thought was of the chessboard, but the thought of going back into that room filled me with dread. I forced myself out of bed, my legs weak and unsteady, and made my way to the study. The door was ajar, even though I was sure I had closed it the night before. I stepped inside, my breath catching in my throat. The board was exactly as I had left it, but the pieces had changed again, the bloodstain now smeared across the board like a macabre signature. My king was in checkmate. I felt a wave of nausea as I realized that this was no ordinary game. The moves were no longer random, they were deliberate, part of some twisted ritual. The blood on the board wasn't just a warning, it was a message. I had lost the game, but the consequences were far from over. The presence in the room had grown stronger, more tangible, and I could feel its eyes on me, waiting for my next move. But I had no more moves to make. The game was over, and I had lost. That night, the dreams came again, more vivid and terrifying than before. I was in the study, the chess pieces towering over me like dark, twisted figures. They moved on their own, closing in on me, their whispers growing louder and more insistent. I tried to run, but my feet were rooted to the floor. The king and queen stood before me, their eyes burning with a malevolent fire, and as they reached out to touch me, I woke up screaming. The presence was no longer confined to the study, it had followed me into my dreams, invading my mind, my soul. And I knew, with a chilling certainty, that it wasn't done with me yet. One afternoon, driven by a desperate need for answers, I returned to the antique shop where I had bought the chess set. The shopkeeper was nowhere to be found, the store eerily deserted, but as I searched through the dusty shelves, I found an old, leather-bound journal tucked away in a corner. The pages were yellowed with age, filled with spidery handwriting that was difficult to read, but as I flipped through it, a sense of horror began to settle in my chest. The journal belonged to a previous owner of the chess set, a man whose name was scratched out in every instance. His words were frantic, disjointed, recounting how the chess set had destroyed his life, how he had tried to get rid of it but failed, how it had driven him to the brink of madness. "The game is not just a game," he had written, the words underlined in a heavy, shaking hand. "It is a battle for your soul. Every move you make brings you closer to the end. And when you lose, it takes everything." My hands trembled as I read the final entry, a chilling description of the last night he spent in the house. He had been alone, playing the game against an unseen opponent, when the pieces had begun to move faster and faster, the board shaking with an unnatural force. The last thing he wrote was a single, scrawled word: "Run." The journal ended abruptly, the pages torn and smeared with what looked like blood. I dropped the journal, my heart pounding in my chest. I had to get out. I had to leave before it was too late. I rushed back home, the shadows lengthening as the sun began to set. The house was silent, an oppressive stillness that made my skin crawl. I packed a bag hastily, throwing in clothes and essentials, but as I headed for the door, I felt a chill run down my spine. The air grew thick, heavy with a presence that I could no longer ignore. I heard the faint sound of the chess pieces clinking against the board, the soft whisper of movement. Against my better judgment, I turned toward the study, my feet carrying me to the room that had become the center of my nightmares. The door was open, the room darker than ever. The chessboard was the only thing illuminated, a soft, unnatural glow emanating from the pieces. They were arranged in a new formation, one that I didn't recognize, but there was no mistaking the ominous intent behind it. My king was surrounded, trapped in a web of black pieces that seemed to pulse with a life of their own. As I stared at the board, I felt a cold breath against my neck, the presence pressing closer, feeding off my fear. And then, without warning, the door slammed shut behind me. The room plunged into darkness, the temperature dropping to a bone-chilling cold. I was trapped, the walls closing in around me, the whispers growing louder, more insistent. The game wasn't over. It had just begun. And this time, there would be no escape. The darkness was suffocating. I stood frozen in the study, my breath coming in shallow gasps as the shadows twisted and writhed around me. The only source of light was the faint, eerie glow emanating from the chessboard. The pieces seemed to shimmer with a malevolent energy, their intricate carvings taking on a life of their own. I could hear the whispering now, louder than ever, a chorus of voices that seemed to come from the very walls, urging me to finish the game. I wanted to scream, to claw my way out of that room, but my feet were rooted to the floor. It was as if the darkness had wrapped itself around me, holding me in place, forcing me to confront the horror that I had brought into my home. The chessboard demanded my attention, the pieces in motion even as I watched. My king was cornered, surrounded by black pieces that moved with a deliberate, menacing intent. The queen, her face now a grotesque mask of malevolence, seemed to grin at me, her eyes burning with an otherworldly fire. The voices grew louder, more insistent, each one urging me to make a move, to finish the game. I could feel the cold breath of the presence on the back of my neck, the weight of its gaze pressing down on me. My hands trembled as I reached out, my fingers hovering over the board. I didn't want to play. I knew that whatever this game was, it wasn't just a game. It was a ritual, a trap set by something far older and far more evil than I could comprehend. But I had no choice. The room seemed to pulse with a dark energy, and I knew that if I didn't make a move, it would consume me. With a shaking hand, I moved my king, a desperate attempt to prolong the inevitable. But as soon as I did, the board erupted in a flurry of movement. The pieces shifted rapidly, the black pieces closing in on my last remaining defenses. My knight was taken, then my bishop, until all that was left was my king, alone and vulnerable in the center of the board. The Black Queen moved with a cruel precision, her face twisted into a sinister smile as she delivered the final blow. Checkmate. The room fell silent, the whispering voices ceasing as the game came to its dreadful conclusion. I stood there, staring at the board, my mind numb with terror. It was over. I had lost. But as the realization sank in, I felt a new wave of fear wash over me. The presence in the room was no longer content to linger in the shadows. It was here, with me, and it was hungry. The temperature in the room plummeted, the cold seeping into my bones. I tried to move, to run, but my body refused to obey. The shadows around me deepened, swirling into a dense fog that began to close in. I could feel it now, the presence pressing against me, surrounding me, its cold fingers brushing against my skin. The darkness thickened, wrapping around me like a shroud, and I knew that I was being pulled into something far worse than death. In those final moments, as the darkness swallowed me whole, I realized the truth. The game had never been about winning or losing. It had been about control, about power, and I had given it everything it needed. The chess set was a prison, a trap designed to ensnare the souls of those foolish enough to play. And now, I was its latest victim, bound to the board, my fate sealed in that final, damning move. As the world faded into nothingness, I heard the whispering voices again, softer now, almost soothing. They told me that I was part of the game now, forever locked in an eternal struggle that would never end. I was no longer the player, I was the piece, doomed to play this cursed game for eternity, with no hope of escape. And somewhere, in the depths of the darkness, I could hear the faint, echoing laughter of the entity that had claimed me. It had won. The game was over. But for me, the nightmare was just beginning. The end. Subscribe for more true scary stories. Thanks for watching.